苏联瓦解之后，中共一方面开始反省第一代民族政策，惧怕新疆走向分裂；另一方面，大量开采新疆资源，加速汉族移民，孤立以维吾尔为主的本地民族，造成对政府不满情绪的积累。整个20世纪90年代，新疆的矛盾持续激化，但中共并没能找到有效的治理办法。
We're facing a radical ideology with inalterable objectives to enslave whole nations and intimidate the world.
2001年911爆发，美国布什政府发动全球反恐战争，同时成为中国新疆政策的节点。
The People's Republic of China very quickly took that opportunity and redefined the problems of separatism or dissent among the Uyghurs as a problem of terrorism.
2002-1198号文件所载决议草案的，请举手。
彼时，美国布什政府出兵伊拉克的计划在国际上受阻，甚至遭到一些盟国的反对。美国需要中国在联合国表决中投赞成票，支持1441号决议，于是和中国做了个交易。
The U.S. would agree to list a Uyghur organization as an international terrorist group if China would abstain in the UN resolution allowing for the American intervention in Iraq.
一个名为东突厥斯坦伊斯兰运动，简称为东伊运的小小组织中了彩，一夜之间，它在大国交易中瞬间飞升海内外。专家们猜测，东伊运被选中，也许正是因为它不起眼。罗伯兹教授曾亲赴东伊运在阿富汗的训练营，访问他们的成员。
Their description of these camps was very poorly resourced. They had one AK-47 machine gun that they could occasionally do target practice with, but otherwise their time was mostly spent trying to renovate this abandoned building they had taken over. It was probably a handful of people, like less than 10. They did say the reason they were training was to eventually start a revolution in Xinjiang.
东伊运头目艾山买和苏木很早就在巴基斯坦被当地军队杀死。这一组织实质上名存实亡，但是在中国政府的宣传中，东伊运这个词不仅指那只有10个人的小组织，它代表了所有对新疆稳定构成威胁的势力。
东伊运等恐怖组织是当前和今后一段时期我国面临的最主要的恐怖威胁。
同时，因为东伊运的名字里有“东突”2字，东突这个本意是东突厥斯坦共和国的名称缩写，更是有意的被混淆概念，变成恐怖主义的代名词。
恐怖主义已成为严重的国际公害，中国政府坚决反对一切形式的恐怖主义活动。
911事件后的中国，泛突厥主义、泛伊斯兰主义或速被恐怖主义、分离主义和极端主义这3股势力替代，反分裂让位于反恐。这些词语的变化，体现了官方对维吾尔以及其他新疆当地民族维稳手段和政策的改变。维吾尔人对中共政权的不满和部分维吾尔组织要求民族自决的意愿，由此被极端化和妖魔化。
I think was disastrous for Uyghurs in the long term because it gave a lot of ability for the Chinese government to crack down on Uyghurs and characterize it as counterterrorism going forward. Because the Chinese government has, to a certain extent, done that. And there's lots of nonviolent organizations of Uyghurs in diaspora who advocate for Eastern Turkestan, but they're certainly not terrorists.
趁国际社会对恐怖主义宣战，加大对伊斯兰教的打击，成为全球趋势。中国政府不去剥离少数极端伊斯兰主义与伊斯兰的区别，反而直指伊斯兰教是维吾尔人反抗的根源，开始用宣传手段制造全社会对维吾尔人和伊斯兰教的恐惧。
On the one hand, that increased the repression of the state towards Uyghurs. On the other hand, it also created a feeling among a lot of Chinese who didn't know who Uyghurs were that these were extremely dangerous people and we should be careful of them. I think helped feed into what's become more and more pronounced Islamophobia in China.
矛盾激化到顶点，任何火花都会造成大爆炸。2009年7月，广东韶关玩具厂的违抗斗殴事件就变成了这样的一个导火索。事件引起乌鲁木齐街头的维族人上街抗议，在警方的干涉下，迅速演变成暴力冲突。
مەيلى خىتاي خەلقى ئۆلگەن بولسۇن مەيلى ئۇيغۇر خەلقى ئۆلگەن بولسۇن ئىككىلى تەرەپتىن ئۆلگەنلەر ئۈچۈن ئىنتايىن قايغۇرىمەن ھەر ئىككى تەرەپنىڭكى ئۆلۈشى كېرەك ئەمەستى بۇنىڭ كەلتۈرۈپ چىقىرىشى جۇڭگو ھۆكۈمىتىنىڭ ئۆزىنىڭ سىياسىتى دەپ قارايمەن。
中国政府用一贯的口径宣称
，75事件它不是民族问题，也不是宗教问题，而是有3股势力在境外煽动，境内实施的严重的暴力犯罪事件，
继而武力镇压。
维吾尔人的任何形式的抗争和抗议呢，都会遭到武力镇压，而镇压之后演变成的冲突，往往都会被中国政府指控成所谓的恐怖。
75事件成为中共新疆政策的转折点。此后，中国政府重拳出手，舆论紧跟。本来被宣传为能歌善舞的维吾尔人，被集体贴上了3股势力的标签。
从上世纪20世纪90年代以来，新疆深受境内外民族分裂势力、宗教极端势力和暴力恐怖势力的侵害，夺去了大量无辜平民的生命。
2014年昆明火车站事件、天安门金水桥事件，更是中共之后在新疆的极端政策得到公众的拥护。
处理这种事情，只有我们还是只有严厉打击，对不对？有这种倾向的，从苗头，对不对？对他们进行处理。
所以我们太可怜了，活到这世上还被人枪把我们打死。
When you start seeing the frustration, the Uyghur population boiling over into violence. And from that point on, it's this vicious cycle of violence, more repression, violence, more repression.
把他摸起来，2个人摸起来，给这儿看一个。
2014年，习近平召开中央民族工作会议，释放信号：民族工作不光要提高少数民族的收入和生活水平，也要抓精神生活，确保认同中国人身份。之后虽然没有明确公开提出第2代民族政策，但同化的导向愈见明显，尤其是对藏维2个民族。
Really, it's a dramatic shift from a kind of centralized top-down multiculturalism to a top-down assimilative push.
主要表现在打压少数民族的宗教生活及其与汉族不同的民族习俗，比如禁维吾尔人蓄须和戴面纱的运动，后来扩展到干预斋月禁忌。维吾尔民族文化也遭受灭顶之灾。
50 or 60-year-old professor who's been lecturing about physics in Uyghur all of his life, well, next year you have to lecture in Chinese to a classroom full of Uyghur students.
各种针对宗教和文化的干预，一开始只是在小范围内，后来扩展到整个地区，渐渐将这些行为定义为非法。
你是犯了什么罪呢？
我以前多次听了非法将军人员讲的一些言论，然后通过听了他的言论之后，我就在脑海里出现了一些极端思想，然后违反了国家法律。
直到有了今天震惊世界的再教育营。
Among the people in the camps now are large numbers of professors and scholars, and particularly those who work on literature. So the field of Uyghur literature and poets and singers and musicians has been decimated by these current policies. These are not people who deal with religion. They're not necessarily religious people. They're highly educated professionals. But we see that this is really an assault on Uyghur culture as well as on religion and supposed extremism.
在中国政府大大压缩维吾尔人宗教自由、民族自治空间的情况下，很多维吾尔人想方设法外逃，通过政府默许、人口走私，或是走官方渠道拿到签证，大批维吾尔人离开中国，去到东南亚， 到了土耳其或其他国家，其中数千人越过土耳其边境到了叙利亚，参与恐怖主义战争。
And one thing that's quite clear is this is not a continuation of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. It seems to be a relatively recent phenomenon due to the pull factors in Syria and the push factors in Xinjiang that are driving people out.
基地组织、伊斯兰国等伊斯兰极端主义的盛行，让恐穆斯林变成全球潮流，中国人也不例外。而在中国，恐穆斯林最简单直接的表现就是反维吾尔人。
One of the major problems with the war on terror is that there is no internationally accepted definition of terrorism. So that has allowed a lot of countries to target any group that they see as a threat for legitimate or illegitimate reasons and to call them terrorists. The other one is that by focusing on this idea of extremism, they've opened the door to characterizing all of Islam as essentially being at the root of terrorism.
中国境内少数民族的民族主义状况错综复杂，维吾尔人要求中国宪法赋予的自治权利的民族主义不能等同于分离主义，而分离主义也不等于恐怖主义。而中共在新疆大规模践踏人权的行为，仿佛有着比反恐反分裂更深一层的意义。
To me, it seems there's a clear link between the goals of the Belt and Road Initiative and the critical location of Xinjiang in that initiative and these mass human rights abuses that we're seeing right now in the region.
这样的联系不无道理。新疆是中国和南亚、中亚、中东以及欧洲开展国际贸易的中转站，有着非常重要的战略地位。“一带一路”计划把喀什、乌鲁木齐、伊犁建成商业和交通枢纽，对该区的控制是成败的关键。
This is a great irony that even as Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative embraces and advertises a new kind of multiculturalism internationally, they're moving towards a unicultural model within China.
回首新疆纷繁复杂的历史，我们清晰地看到新疆问题的由来。目前，中共大力倡导伊斯兰教中国化政策，强制社会主义核心价值观教育进清真寺，穆斯林爱国主义教程进清真寺。这些强权政策无法满足维吾尔人历来对把握自己命运的渴望，反而让恩怨变成永远解不开的恶性循环。
What we're seeing right now in Xinjiang is a cautionary tale to the world because that logic, brings us full circle back to the logic of National Socialism during World War II. And hopefully we're not, as a world, returning to that.